All right, well, welcome everybody to our next Learning Lab conversation at the Oceanside Sanctuary. We are doing a series of these panel discussions around the bigger question, why church? So why is it that in an age of increasing nones in the United States, meaning those people who identify as no particular religious tradition, that's the single biggest religious demographic in the United States now, and also the fastest growing demographic in the United States. In the midst of that, and in the midst, of course, of this enormous polarization that we see exemplified by our big national election last night that still hasn't been resolved and is not likely to be resolved for another day or two at least. And then, of course, no matter what the outcome of this election is, all of the problems that have led to this election are still going to be with us for the next several years. So in the midst of all of that the church seems to be so complicit with, the question is, why would we expect anybody to choose to be a part of a church? And how is it that we can be a church that is still relevant and good and impactful in people's lives? You know, in other words, be something that people actually want to be a part of. We've been doing this for several weeks now. Today's conversation is centered around the question, what is the future of leadership? Meaning, what is the future of how we express a form of leadership in our churches that genuinely reflects the character of Christ? And I'm excited to have some guests with me again today. So let's just go around the room and introduce them. Most of my guests have been with me before. So let's start with the Reverend Donnell White, who's the lead pastor at the Ann Arbor Vineyard in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome, Donnell. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. Just finished preaching. Glad to be here. The sun is shining, full of hope.
Okay, take note, dear viewers, that Donnell is in the great state of Michigan and is filled with hope for the outcome of this election. That's an interesting thing to hear. I'm sure we'll loop back around to that in just a moment. Next up, we have Yanni Prada, who is the lead pastor at Heartway Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Also, another state that was big in the news last night. Welcome, Danny. How are things in Florida going?
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know. I have not left my house. I'm afraid to, so.
I don't know why we're laughing, because it's, terrifying that you would say that. But at the same time, maybe it's just our way of like diffusing our anxieties that we laugh about these sorts of things. Well, super excited to have you with us. This is the second time that you've been able to join one of these, and really enjoyed your insights last time around. And then next up, we have Pastor Brian Metzger, who's the senior pastor at the Raleigh Vineyard in Raleigh, North Carolina. Another key state in this election. Brian, how is the political climate in North Carolina today?
It's very tense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very tense. I'm working hard to get to where Donnell is. I'm working hard to maintain my hope, but things are a little bit tense here.
Yeah, I get that. Well, thank you for joining me. Brian's joined me on several of these calls going back to the summer when we did the American God series, and always really appreciate Brian's insights. I know that you guys will too. And then last but not least, of course, we have a newcomer to these panel discussions, Yanni Davis, who is the Reverend Yanni Davis, part of my denomination, the Disciples of Christ. And Yanni is somebody that I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of years ago at a conference here in San Diego, and really brought some powerful prophetic and poetic words to that conference. And I've just really enjoyed seeing how Yanni's ministry has developed over the years. And more recently, Yanni has launched a couple of new endeavors. She has a ministry called My Supernatural Life, and I'll let her describe that in just a moment. But also, Yanni's the pastor of Saluhu. Am I getting that right? Saluhu?
Yes.
Saluhu is a really interesting ministry. It's a church, but it's a translocal church, meaning that it's not rooted simply in just one little neighborhood or city, that extends beyond those boundaries. And just really occurs to me that is something that a lot of churches have stumbled into with the COVID pandemic going on. And so I'm wondering, how's all that going for you, Yanni? What are you discovering in the midst of that?
Yeah, so I'm discovering it's a lot of work still, and also recognizing that as these things sort of expand due to this virtual digital era we're in, it's more folks to track, which is a beautiful thing. And so I'm able to get creative in all of the ways, as a church planter, as a movement leader, as a spiritualist, as a hip hopper, as a poet. So glad to be here. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, really, really excited to have you. Everybody on this call, one of my favorite things about these calls is that we always have folks who are mainliners, and we always have folks who are part of evangelical traditions. And so I really appreciate that we have a diversity of perspectives on these calls. And so today we're going to jump into this question, what is the future of leadership? And it just seems like there's no way for us to talk about leadership and what the future of leadership might be without acknowledging that we are now in the midst of another national election, and that the incumbent president of the United States, Donald Trump, really seems to represent all of the character traits that are in opposition to the person that we center our lives around as Christians. And yet we in the United States have at least half of the voters, or roughly half of the voters in our country, have really identified Donald Trump's style of leadership as a good form of leadership for our country. I'm wondering how you guys respond to that as leaders in churches and ministries when you're working with your people in your own congregations, who I'm sure have diverse political perspectives. People in my congregation have diverse political perspectives as well. How do you address the fact that nearly half our nation seems to think that Donald Trump's style of leadership, forget policies, style of leadership, it seems to be in complete opposition to who Jesus is? Who wants to jump into that question first?
I'll go. So the growing up in an apostolic tradition, which is what I grew up in, I think a lot of what I'm confronting is the duality of America as a Christian nation, but we are not electing a pastor in chief. And what I'm finding is that we don't spend enough time inspecting what that means, right? So at one level, we want to claim Jesus as our own, as our birthright, manifest destiny, all that good stuff about Jesus sending people here to the United States or to the Americas in order to evangelize and to save the whole world, right? Like this is something that's key to how we see. And then how we vote for our self-interest. And when just in preaching today, I was just talking out of Acts 19 today, just thinking through the narrative of when my self-interest is harmed. So you're looking. I don't know what happened, Jason. You muted me. Did you not like what I was saying? I mean, there's an easier way for you to do that. Okay. So,
No. I meant to mute myself. I'm so sorry.
I'm like right there. It's just like, nope, we're done. Call's over. All right. So right in Ephesus in Acts 19, you have the goddess Diana and Artemis. And Paul comes in, he's healing people, he's transforming people. And what does it do? Well, it threatens the very economic livelihood of the city. What do the unions and the guilds do? They get together to resist Paul. Why? Because the gospel, when the gospel is actually being preached, it undermines empire. It undermines idolatry. And when idolatry makes us money, we have some questions to ask and to answer. And I think that's what we're seeing, Jason. I think Trump has figured out how to articulate a white liberation theology. And he is offering hope to white people who are seeing the world for them and the country for them change. The demographers have told us the country is no longer white. That there's just no coming back from that. That's already done. So now there's a change that's afoot. And if you're feeling like, well, I was on top and now maybe I'm going to be on the bottom, and I'll give it to you this way. I was meeting with a congregant, and this congregant said to me, Blacks have been oppressed in the country for hundreds of years, so I could understand if you were like, it's time for the whites to be oppressed. And I was like, in what world does that even make sense? There's no Black people organizing to oppress white people. You know what we want? We want you to leave us alone. That's what we want. We don't want to oppress you. We just want to be able to live alongside you without barriers, right? But that's the narrative that people have been given, is that someone has to be on top and therefore oppressing someone who is not. And that is a fearful narrative. And then you have a voice who says, I will protect you. I will support you. I will make sure you stay on top. Well, of course, people are going to vote for that. And what we're going to see is that white evangelicals, once again, voted for Donald Trump in significant numbers. And it's going to crush the efforts of the multi-ethnic church, which is what I lead. I lead a multi-ethnic church. It's just going to reaffirm for folks who look like me that maybe we're not safe in multi-ethnic churches anymore.
Yeah. I mentioned this to you guys. I think some of you who were on the call when we were discussing an earlier topic a few weeks ago, but our church is going through a period of reevaluating, sort of renewing our vision, mission, values, all that kind of stuff. And so part of that process is we're taking input from people, in the congregation. We're asking them, kind of how they respond to our current vision, mission, values, all that kind of stuff. And so we're recording their comments. It's like qualitative data, for us as we're trying to figure this out. And one of the comments that we got several weeks ago was from a brand new congregant who, this is a family of color who had decided after George Floyd to leave their largely white evangelical church. And what's surprising is that they opted into our largely white mainline church, so, and I was asking them, like, what's that about? I mean, why, what is it about us that seems, safer to you? Because we're not a very ethnically diverse congregation, unfortunately, yet. And their answer was that we were at least willing to talk about Black lives and how Black lives matter and the injustices against people of color that are perpetuated systemically by American police, that we were willing to discuss those things. And then an interesting comment, and sorry to take so long to frame this, but you just reminded me of this. An interesting comment one of them made was, we're noticing a quiet exodus of Black people from white churches. And so what you just said, really reminded me of that, because as I've sort of tried to observe a little bit what's going on, I think that's very true. I think one of the casualties of this unveiling of the fact that we live in a deeply authoritarian and racist country, one of the casualties of that is 40 or 50 years of evangelicalism's effort to really become ethnically diverse, because there is a high value for diversity in evangelicalism, which is good. But now there's this disillusionment because that diversity itself has not solved the problem of authoritarianism and racism. And so what you said just reminded me of that. And so I wanted to share that.
Yeah. So I think for me, as I think about folks leaving the church in general, and also Black folks leaving spaces that are predominantly white. Speaking from my own perspective, I've suffered a great deal of harm at the hands of Christian community throughout the years, whether it was seminary, whether it was leadership in white spaces. because I feel like there's a disconnect in terms of Euro-Christian thought and the reality of what Christianity really is. And I like to take people back to the thought that Jesus was burnt bronze. Jesus was darker than me, right? With this kind of woolly hair. Have we forgotten, right? A poor man, right? A nomad, going from place to place with nowhere to live, right? Eating based off of the kindness of those that he ran into, right? Being cared for by the community, right? There was no established church that took care of Jesus, right? And so a lot of times I try to think about Black liberation theology even, and I think about Howard Thurman and a Jesus love ethic. There is not a Jesus love ethic happening in our churches. We have social hours, we have segregated hours, we have, we have playtime, we have programming. But do we really have a Jesus love ethic where we're learning people intimately, where we're not just saying inclusive or diverse, but actually taking the steps to make sure our churches are establishing that? Right. I've been the pastor in 2 white congregations. And at the end of the day, I'm thankful for them. I love them. But at the same time, it is a very dangerous place to be as the only Black, queer, woman, non-gender conforming, disabled, right? As we go down the list, right? So I'm able to speak for, not that I want to speak for everybody, but I can speak for a large demographic of people that are both churched and unchurched, to say, hey, let's take it back. Jesus was a poor, burnt bronze man with woolly hair. Let's start there, church.
So there are so many questions I want to ask in response to that, but and so I don't want to lose what you said, Yanni, about having been harmed in those spaces.
Yes.
And the one that really jumped out at me was seminary. And so maybe at some point, if we have an opportunity, we could loop back around to that. Because actually, I think how we're raising up leaders in our churches is extraordinarily relevant to this conversation.
Yes.
But maybe before we revisit that question, I'm wondering, what does good leadership then, or what does Christ-like leadership look like in churches that are wrestling with this dichotomy between a version of Jesus that seems to be in solidarity with the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed on the one hand, versus a version of Jesus that I think Donnell described very well, which is Jesus who simply enables us to pursue our own self-interests. And for the majority of people in this country who look a lot like me, right? White, straight, male, cis, right? Pursuing my own self-interests means literally maintaining the status quo of authoritarianism and racism, right? So, how is it that you guys are trying to highlight that dichotomy between those two versions of Jesus and what it means to be a good leader?
Specifically to me, Jason, or anyone?
Well, anybody who wants to jump in, but please feel free, Yanni, just to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to flip what prosperity gospel means, in terms of prosperity being wholeness and wellness, right? And people's needs being met, versus this ideal of let's keep our power structures as they are, both in the church and outside the church.
Amen to that.
I think the question that I'm wrestling with right now is, how do we live together? How do we live together? Is that possible? And what does this moment in time require of me as a leader? Sometimes is time to flip the tables. Other times is the time to sit at a table and extend your hand to the person on the other side and say, I want to understand. Mm-hmm. I don't know how some folks in our community, specifically at Heartway, even can feel safe at our community anymore, to be honest. Nobody has really said anything to me, but I do wonder, in light of so much of the support sometimes that I see within even my own community for the leader of our country and the ideology that empowers him. I wonder how LGBTQ people and Black people and so many others can even feel comfortable within my own community. So I think, I'm an Enneagram 9, and my tendency is to really try and keep the peace as much as possible. But what does that look like now? I don't have answers. I don't know. What I do know is that there are times that we make assumptions about people who support the president that may not necessarily be true for them. You understand? So, we may see support for the president as, this is racist. If you vote for this guy, you are a racist. It's obvious. And it's not obvious, obviously, for a lot of people. It's not, to us, it's obvious. To those people, it's not obvious. So what I've noticed is when our reaction because our reaction to the mess has been so strong, right? As it should be, right? That's okay. It needs to be. We need these prophetic voices, right? But sometimes, I guess, because the reaction has been so strong, sometimes leading people to respond to hate with more hate or evil with more evil without intention, but it's just what's happening. People on the other side look at that, and now they're saying, look at this reaction, look at this hatred. And then they discredit what's actually underneath all of that is valid, if that makes sense. So it's like, what do you do so people can listen to you? If you are one of these folks who are in marginalized communities, what do you do for people to listen to you? You can try and be peaceful. Nobody listens. The status quo remains. But then we try and really put our forces together and stand up and be strong. And that doesn't seem to be working either. So I don't even know if this is a helpful thing. It's more of a venting for me, but this is just, it's a very challenging predicament to be in as a pastor and as leaders and as Christians. It's challenging.
No, I mean, please go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, I think, in answer to your question, I think that leadership in the way of Jesus today looks like what Danny has just been doing, that we don't need self-confident leaders who have all the answers, who can stand up and give us this singular vision and say, if you'll just all get behind me and do what I say, I'll lead you to a better day. It's a willingness to wrestle with these issues and realize that we're not talking about ideas, we're talking about human beings. And that what we're called a pastor are not ideas or ideologies or any of our isms, that we're called to pastor people, and people are complex, people are mysterious, people have layers, and that as pastors we've got to be willing to get down to that place of wrestling with the issues that are there and doing it out loud, so that the people that we're trying to pastor can see how Jesus would wrestle with these things, how we would work through these issues, and not just no more space for leaders who go up on the mountain and come down with their edict and say, "Thus saith the Lord." That is not what we need today, and that's just not Jesus. Jesus did not lead that way, and so I would just contend we need more wrestlers. That's what we need.
One more thing, and Brian, I really appreciate your words there. I have a bunch of folks in my congregation who are from Venezuela, who literally moved over here with their families not that long ago, who have family members and friends still living in Venezuela that are suffering tremendously, and they have seen what socialism, as they call it, gone bad looks like. I'm Cuban. My grandfather and my grandmother on my mom's side were the first ones from our family to get to the United States, right? So they also were running away from something that was very scary and very challenging for them in their home country. With the narrative that the president has presented, a lot of these folks, they are willing to look past character defect, leadership defects, just because they are afraid that if Joe Biden wins or if the Democratic Party wins, America's going to become socialist. And they have a lot of ideas of what that looks like already, and it doesn't work, and they refuse to give an inch. That's kind of the complexity, at least in my context, that we're dealing with here. It's not as easy as saying, "Oh, this person supports Trump. They're an idiot." It's just not that easy. So what we really need is leadership that is willing to at least seek to understand where others are coming from, instead of just point blank assume that we know where others are coming from because of a vote.
Can't hear you, Donnell. You're not muted.
I think for me, until we get Donnell back, the scary part for me is that Black folks have lived in this reality for a very long time. If we, take it back to the transatlantic slave trade, if we think about, the civil rights movement, Jim and Jane Crow, as we think about, any of the movements for Black lives that have happened, we've kind of been in a place, a sedentary place, as it relates to our everything, right? Our essence, our lives, our truths. To constantly live in a state of fear that just driving, could be the cause of my death, that ordering food at a fast food restaurant could be, any number of things could be the end all for me. And recognizing that no matter who's in office, no matter who the president is, this is the continued reality for Black folks in the country. I also am thinking about how there's a lack of living into the truths of what it means to be anti-racist in this country, and the prevalence of anti-Blackness is also very disturbing here in this country, in the world. And so I often wrestle with, as a leader, right, Jesus did come in and say, these are the laws, these are the commandments, this is how you live your life. And so sometimes I think within the church, there's a little bit too much wrestling, a little bit too much back and forth around what is right and the ways of Jesus as we think about ethics, as we think about morality, as we think about this need for Black lives to stop dying in the streets. And so I understand this framework of the leadership, the both and the sitting with the different dynamics and realities coming up for folks. And I think in my context, though, as a Black person, it's hard to sit with the reality that no matter who wins, things will ultimately be the same in terms of our isms in the church and outside the church.
So I'd like, if I could, maybe to try to connect some of what both Yanni and Danny have said, if it makes sense to do that. Because what I hear you saying, Yanni, is that there's a gap between, even in churches that are willing to speak about these issues, there's a gap between the rhetoric and the actual lived anti-racism that's required to make a difference, right? And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's not just a social media issue. You know, we often give lip service to, you know, we signal our virtues in order to sort of build our tribe. But when it comes to actually the rubber meeting the road and paying the price of living out anti-racism work, oftentimes we're just not willing to do that. And I think there are a long list of reasons why that's true, but usually it can most easily be boiled down to losing money. And then to connect that to what Danny said, you know, Danny asked the really great question, how do we live together after this? And he admitted that he's an Enneagram 9, right? And I'll just, in full transparency, admit that I'm a 5, which means I just want to understand how everything works, right? So I couldn't care less if we're at peace with each other or not. I just want to understand how it works. So, but in Danny's question, I think really does surface the reality that when we live in the way that Christ led and lived, that we are paying a high price for revealing how the powers that be are, by design, oppressing certain groups of people, right? Marginalizing certain groups of people, keeping poor certain groups of people, right? And so the problem, of course, with the prophets is that they did highlight those disparities and were killed for it. And Jesus did highlight those disparities and he was killed for it. And we can't expect, I don't mean this as an argument with you, Danny, at all, but we can't expect, obviously, that to the extent that we're willing to flip over the tables in order to expose those inequalities, if that's what good Christ-like leadership does, then it creates a couple of realities. The first is we're going to make a lot of people very angry, namely people who have that power and have that privilege and have those resources, because we're indicting them, right? So it's not going to create peace in the short run. It's going to create more division. It's going to create more conflict. It's going to create more anger. And then the second reality that occurs to me is, in the history of the narrative of the gospel between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the people who are willing to flip those tables over usually lose. Like, in other words, leading like Jesus doesn't mean being guaranteed of success. And I'll just share that this has been a very bitter pill for me to swallow in my ministry life. I realized at one point, many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was leading in youth ministry in a small church in the mountains of Utah, of all places. I was in Park City, Utah, and we were trying to get something off the ground. And I was trying to grow a big youth group and do something super awesome and cool in town. You know, I was jealous of the other youth ministry in town that was really doing well and gaining a lot of the cool kids. And we tried to get some initiative off the ground. It didn't work. And I was very, very angry with God that God didn't like anoint my ministry with success. And then I was having one of those like angry conversations with God in the car. Like, you know, that's usually where that happens for me, where I was like, you know, I did everything you asked me to do, you know, why this and why that? And just in one of those like moments where you feel like you really hear from God, right? Like, you know, I can think of a few of those moments in my life. I felt like, you know, God said, you know, I asked you to obey me. I didn't guarantee that you'd succeed. And I was like, well, and I remember very clearly saying in response, I think out loud, if I'm not going to succeed, why would I follow you? And then I was like, oh no. I have a problem, right? Like I have an idolatry problem. So what you were describing, Danny, really reminded me of that moment, because I think one of the things that's really hard is that as ministers of the gospel, we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that leading like Christ means that things are going to work out the way we hope they will. So I don't know if that's a tension for anybody else. Maybe just for me, because I am white, and doing things the way they've always been done generally makes things go well for me.
Right. Well, I mean, for sure, coming into North Carolina, where I am surrounded by mega, you know, there definitely was made very clear to me in no uncertain terms that the expectation of success here was that we would have an ever-growing congregation until we finally reached, you know, we got upsized to the mega, you know, ranks as well. And as soon as I started to teach that that's not what success looks like in the kingdom, I, you know, started losing people and getting into confrontations with other people who had brought me here to be the great white savior to turn us into a mega. And so I think you're absolutely right. To follow Jesus, to lead like Jesus, we have to divest ourselves of power, and we have to divest ourselves of the expectation that God is interested in the same thing we're interested in terms of what success should look like. And that will be, what is it? Was it Wendell Berry or somebody said, you know, leadership is disappointing people at a rate at which they can handle, tolerate. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. At least that's, for me, that's a big part of it. I work very hard to disappoint people.
We'll see if my mic's working. Am I coming through? Okay, good. Sorry. I don't know what happened. It was still connected. So a couple of things. One, this part of the conversation I really appreciate because, and I'm going to say, I think it was N.T. Wright who helped me come closer to this reality, which is not the person you might expect me to quote for that. Because what he did is he helped me locate Jesus in his social, political, historical context. He said that Jesus was a real person who lived in an empire. As has already been stated, he was, the greatest miracle Jesus ever committed was being a tall, blonde, Nordic white man in Palestine in the 1st century. So putting that aside, Jesus has a lot in common with the lived experiences of African Americans, at least in the United States, right? James Cone hones in on that, and then he brings that to the fore, and then others pick up his baton and continue his narrative. And so leading like Jesus in this present age, I think, Jason, just to echo what you said, for me, it became God didn't call me to success. He called me to faithfulness. And so then what does it mean to be faithfully present with a group of people who are emerging and saying, we don't have everything right. We don't know everything. But if you're willing to stay at the table, I'm willing to sit on the same side of the table with you, looking at the problem so that we have mutual agreement and understanding of what the problem is. And together from the same side of the table, let's figure out what our next step's going to be. So as we wade in to like the conversation that we're in right now, part of what we've had to do is name things. And what I was surprised by was, like what Danny said, it seemed so clear to me. This is idolatry. You know, white supremacy is not going to save us. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Like, there is no whites only section of heaven. Like, I don't get it. Like, you're going to get to heaven and Jesus is going to have a corporeal body, and that body's going to look like the body he had in the first century. He's going to be a short, brown-skinned, kinky-haired guy. He's not going to be much to look at. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to look at him and go, no, this ain't the Jesus I was worshiping. Is there a different option? Like I just don't understand it, because it seems so straightforward, like Danny said. But then I realized, like, this is why Trump, at least in one narrative, is winning the narrative, is because he's offering an alternative. He's saying, no, that's not real. That's garbage. Like, your God is made in your image, and your God looks like you, and your God is a winner. But we know, like you just said, Jason, that our God is the loser God. Like, our God loses. When he comes up against empire, empire does what empire does. It crushes him under the wheels of oppression, and it moves on. You look at the Roman Empire, Jesus is barely a footnote in their story of how they tell their story, right? And so then what does that tell us? As Christians, it tells us, if our goal is to be on top, we need a different God. I mean, we just need a different God. And that's why I loved your American God series, right? It's like, let's just create the gods that work for us, but stop calling it Christian. Stop calling it Jesus. Call it what it is. It's idolatry. Call it what it is.
Yeah. And I think that for me, where I think we sometimes find an inability to connect the realities of racism that we live with in the United States, and just sort of the way that we're steeped in white supremacy. I think one of the reasons why we have a hard time bridging the gap in that narrative and talking about racism is because of other sort of ideologies that have become gods to us, like individualism, for example. Like, it's very easy for people to be offended. You know, Donnell, if I were in your church and you were like, I don't understand what you don't get about white supremacy, I'd be like, well, I don't have a problem. I go to a church that's pastored by a black guy. Clearly, I'm not a racist, right? Like, that is such a patently obvious response that typical, like, well-meaning white people would have. But I've found a lot more traction in indicting or accusing the narrative of success and power and strength. Because as much as people want to deny that they're benefiting from white supremacy, they have no desire to deny that they want to win. They have no desire to deny that they think God is powerful, right? And so when I accuse people of worshiping a God that is a winner and is, powerful, and, and that me following that God therefore imputes success and power and winning to me, when I start poking that bear, people have visceral reactions because everybody wants to win. And they think that, again, like me, they think following Jesus leads them to winning. And I think you're right that Donald Trump has told that story, has used that narrative exceptionally well. He has let everybody off the hook where racism is concerned. He's confirmed their individual bias towards them not being racist because they have a black friend, or because they go to a church pastored by a black person or whatever. And he has given them permission to embrace a theology of toxic competitive masculinity. And so, I guess my question is, like, is there any future for a version of leadership that puts forth a God who loses?
Well, if I could speak from a womanist standpoint, when
Yes.
I think about centering myself as like a Black woman, right, and coming up against some of these Euro-Christianized ways of thinking, this high Christology, these notions of what it means to win or to have power. For me, I no longer want to be seen as some strong Black woman, but rather a woman that walks in my power and my authority. So that does shift my understanding of success. It does shift my ability to serve white congregations and not be harmed in the midst of it. It means I flip what I'm doing in the world to make sure I am not being harmed in the midst of doing my good work to love on people. So currently, I'm a pastorless. I'm a churchless pastor. I'm a churchless pastor, and that is okay with me, right? As I figure out what it means to navigate in this world as a leader. Also, I think that we must press beyond just sharing these thoughts and notions with people, but actually being prophetic in our witness, right? Prophecy is powerful. That's what made Jesus powerful. Not that he was just sharing parables or breaking things down in a very beautiful way. He was literally calling forth the future that we were to see. And we still don't see that future. So maybe it's time to really get our foots in people's behinds versus just saying, let's all sit at a table while those that are Black and brown and poor are subject to mistreatment, and then we focus on forgiveness so much. But what about resistance before forgiveness, right? What about actually dismantling some of these systems and structures? What about folks actually sitting with what is not correct and right and loving and compassionate within them before demanding forgiveness from those that have been subject to society's ills? So it's time for us to get prophetic. It's time for us to start centering the voices of Black and brown folks and women, especially. I think there's a call for leadership of women. Men for too long have had the power and have not done the right things with them. If we look at our presidents of past and our presidents of old, I do not have very much hope in the government and the system as it is for myself as a womanist Christian theologian.
Yeah, thank you for, part of what you're doing for me here in this conversation is reminding me that the good news for white men in America might be that they're called to serve a God who fails. But part of the good news for Black women in America might be that they're called to serve a God who can empower them and help them to win, right? In other words, how do I put this? Like, there's a guy, some of you guys might know, his name's Barry Taylor. He's has history in the Anglican Church and has a podcast with a friend of mine that talks about the future of theology, essentially. And recently on a podcast, they were talking about one of our panel discussions because his podcast partner was one of our panelists. And they were talking about our question, what's the future of the gospel? And he said in that podcast, something that I thought, was great. He said, I think the gospel looks like Jesus flipping over the tables. And the point, of course, he was trying to make is that the gospel is often counterintuitive, right? Which is kind of the point we're all making here today. But it occurred to me when he said that, while I agree with him, that for some people at some point, at some time in a particular context, the gospel might be flipping over tables. For other people, the gospel is setting a table, right? So in other words, I think for people who have been denied power and denied a voice and denied equity and denied dignity, that the gospel for them is a gospel that invites them into a space where they can be centered, where they can have power where it was denied to them before. Whereas for others, the gospel means letting go of that power. So, Jesus, of course, says, blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. That's the gospel. right? It takes two totally different forms depending on who it's being delivered to. And so it's easy for me to embrace like the woe to the rich part of the gospel, because sorry, go ahead.
If I may share, I think that dichotomy of winners versus losers is a little dangerous territory to step into. And I say that because I love white people. I want to be in community with white folks. There is nothing in me that does not want that. And I don't want white men, and it's similar to what Donnell was saying. I don't want white men to have to lose in order for, you know, Black women to be in places of, you know, authority, power, whatever, leadership. I think there needs to be an understanding of how we all win together. Right. And that means white men having to come up off some of the power, come up off some of the money, right? Come up off some of the thoughts even. Like, and sometimes people, white men in particular, you know, look, y'all, everybody's different. Everybody's learning. We all in this together. But if I can be honest, in situations, a lot of situations this past year, I've heard white men say, I'm sorry I marginalized you, right? And I'm like, you didn't put me in a place of the peripheral. You didn't render me invisible. You missed out on a valuable lesson by not honoring me and acknowledging all that I am. Right. So I think that dichotomy is a little scary and will keep us in these places of Black and white, red and blue. Right. White men, Black women. If we don't think about what it means for white men, white people to recognize we're in this all together and that you miss out when you don't have the full experience.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate so much everything that's being brought to the table here. I do also recognize that there's a time for everything. There's a time for everything. And the issues are so big and so large that we need many different ways of approaching this so that the kingdom can come, you know, and so that peace can be experienced. With that being said, I don't know how this is in your specific context, right? All of us have our own context, and how we are to respond in our own context is going to be very unique. And we have to be open and sensitive to how the Spirit is calling us to respond in our particular context, you know, for the sake of the gospel. Nevertheless, in my context, I have some Black friends that vote for Donald Trump and who do not like it when other Black people speak of Blacks in a monolithic way, as if your opinion is all of our opinion. I know these people. I've talked to these people. You know, so that's another, where do you even begin with that? That's one thing. The other part about it is, I think it's very important to remember what Jesus said. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Because these same friends that I have, you know, a lot of them, they'll say, well, look at all these long lists of achievements that the president has done for Black people. I mean, he's funding historically Black colleges for the next 10 years. He's doing this and opportunity zones and this, that, the other. Look at these long list of things. On the one hand, I've heard people saying this. But then I have my best friend, Black guy, my best friend in the world since high school, who says, yeah, that's nice. All those lists of accomplishments are nice. But because of the rhetoric and because of the language being used, it's not even safe for me to walk down the street as a Black person. You know, so I try and point people to that reality, which is, okay, fine, let's say, look at how amazing it's been that, you know, all these accomplishments that Trump has done for the Black community, as some would say. That's fine. But because of the language, because of the words, because of the divisiveness, it's really not even safe to be Black or brown in this country, you know, and because that has created so much tension with people. You know, so that for me it's been interesting to see how people are willing to look over issues of character, even though no presidential candidate is going to be like squeaky clean, right? Especially in politics, you're going to get trashed, and you're going to be discredited in every way possible. So, the other side can't say, oh, look, we have the beautiful candidate here who is just squeaky clean. But it's interesting how often we're willing to look over issues of character for the sake of, I just want to support abortion, anti-abortion. I want to just support these main causes, or I want my party to win. And for Jesus followers, kind of like Donnell said, I don't know. I don't know if we can continue to just let that happen without addressing the fact that there's a contradiction here, that we're saying we're a Christian nation, but we don't want real Jesus-like leadership. It's an issue.
So I wonder if we could switch our attention over from sort of the character of leadership that looks like Christ, which we've talked about up to this point. We've talked about Christ's leadership and prophetic leadership in general being leadership that's willing to pour itself out for those who are disempowered, marginalized, poor, oppressed, and so on. We've talked about letting go of the addiction to being successful, or maybe being powerful, or our addiction to authoritarianism as a form of good leadership, but rather being willing to just be faithful, even if we don't succeed according to kind of our addiction to success in the United States. So what I'd love to do is maybe in our remaining 15, 20 minutes is talk about how we maybe raise up leadership that reflects the kind of character we've described here. So how do we create or train leaders in our congregations or in our ministries that are able to avoid or maybe be inoculated against the tendency to be sucked into a brand of leadership that is authoritarian or is about supremacy of one kind or another? How do we guard against that in our ministries or our churches? And I do, by the way, I'm sorry, I do, by the way, I would love to hear Yanni at some point fold in her comment about seminary here too, because I think that's part of our trouble.
Yeah. So one of the ways I think we try to approach that is with stories that are disruptive and that place people in proximity with others. So a good example of something I'm working on right now is warrant resolution in our county. So warrants are the number one way that people get arrested, and a lot of people don't know they have warrants. And so how do we change that story? And what does that look like? So maybe the origin story is, why are dads, absentee dads in families, right? So that might be the question that someone prompts in. But then you don't realize, like, if you get a bench warrant because you missed a court case, you can be arrested at any time, which could cause you to lose your job, which could cause you to lose your housing, which could cause you to lose your car, which could cause you to lose access to your kid. Like, just like that. And those of us with means, we don't have contact with the criminal justice system. And if we do, we have the resources to make that a smooth interaction. Others don't have that. So what I've been learning, and this is largely from one of my female pastors, because we co-pastor, and she's always, because I will start, because since we're confessing Enneagrams, I'm an 8, so I'm a challenger. So I will always start with what's wrong, and here's what you need to do to make it right. And she will say, but that tends to go from negative first to positive. And what she has been pushing on me about is, like, can we tell a better story? And what I see in scripture, and I think I mentioned this on our last call because I was preaching about it last week, but when Paul had to deal with the Judaizers who came down and said you had to be circumcised to be a part of the faith, he got into a debate. And then he realized he really wasn't going to win that debate. And he took a different tack. He said, every time we preach the gospel, the Holy Spirit shows up among the Gentiles. And who among us wants to stop the move of the Holy Spirit where the Spirit wants to go? He just told them a better story. And so when we tell better stories, I think that's how we create better leaders. Because I believe, I was on a call with some Indian pastors this week, and they asked a question. They said, as they were ministering to new communities, the folks who were being ministered to said, "Can I keep my gods and come to Jesus?" And at one level, we might all say on the call, "No, you can't do that. That's idolatry. That's bad." But then I realized, I was like, well, what if Jesus is actually a better choice among the pantheon of gods? And that what happens over time is that you rely less on those gods because you're relying more on Jesus. And then it's just like, that just feels a little bit better at the end of the day, like that Jesus is telling ultimately a better story. And he invites us to inhabit that story. And when we inhabit that story, I think there is real transformation. And again, notwithstanding what has already been said about dismantling, flipping tables, like all of that is in there as well. But I think if we tell better stories, I think we can produce better leaders. And the challenge is, because so much of Christianity is consumer-based, when we start to tell those better stories, some people may leave in the midst of the narrative and may miss the opportunity. But I feel like we're still called to tell and invite them into those stories.
That's good. Thank you.
All I could talk about is goodness and grace. That's my grandmother's name, the one I never could replace. So I fill in the space for the words that were written for the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Jews, Muslims, and the Christians. Atheist, agnostic, lover of life. I got a message in a bottle, came to shore one night. I'm so sure of the love that I have in my heart that when I open up my mouth, know I'm doing my part. Religion is a sentiment. We try to set a precedent on how to live a good existence, but I'm just persistent. It's matter of factly, I know it's got to be all the love overflowing from inside of me. And I think sometimes, when we get to talking about religions and denominations and sectors and all of it, we end up missing out on the love from my understanding. No matter, what you believe or what you practice, God, we are all God's children, and essentially saved by grace, not because of the law or judgment or right or wrong, but because God is, and God will continue to be. If I take it back to when I was entering seminary, I had already helped to plant a church in Atlanta, Rise Community Church, and my grandfather was a bishop of Bermuda. My father has been a Presbyterian pastor for 45 years, and my father has instilled in me to lead the people in love. And so if I think about seminary and the jokes around, be careful in the cemetery, you might, lose your faith. If you come out on the other side with your faith, then you're supposed to be doing this thing. And I think that's what happened with me, entering class the first day and a professor bringing up a Kanye West and Jay-Z reference and being like, "Oh, Yanni, I'm sure you can help us navigate this." Sir, because I'm the only Black person in the class, or because since the age of 14, I've been traveling internationally as a teaching artist, right? So these things that come up make you question, what did this person have in their heart as they're speaking to me in this way, this Christian professor. And so what I've come to understand and realize is that I've got to continue to lead people in love, no matter their ignorance, right? No matter the division, right? No matter how they view me at the end of the day, I've got to continue leading the people in love. And so in seminary, the curriculums, they need help. They need support, right? There's no going out and serving in the real world if you've never been exposed to Black communities, right? And the support that they need. Never been exposed to populations of folks from Venezuela, from Mexico, and so I think what happens is a lot of folks go out and to do ministry, and they haven't been exposed to all that they need to be exposed to culturally, in terms of diversity, in terms of different ways of thinking and being in the world. And so we end up with 50% of folks here in America thinking Christianity is one thing, with leaders that haven't been immersed and entrenched in what it means to be prophetic and lead the people in love, not in terms of some false sense of power and control and money. And also I'll say this, I think we don't have the leadership that we need because a lot of people have a lot at risk at the end of the day. They have a lot, right? I'm single, I don't got no kids, it's just me, right? And so I realize I'm able to say some things and navigate in some ways that both limit my reach in terms of where I'll be invited to, but also allows me to speak authentically and real at the end of the day, because I don't care if you don't invite me to your church at the end of the day. So hope some of that made sense.
No, it made a lot of sense. And I think a lot of what you just said, thank you very much. I think a lot of what you said was a really outstanding answer to Danny's really important question that he raised earlier about how we lead beyond this moment and live with each other. I think so much of what you just said is really directly relevant to that. Also reminded me a bit that, one of my favorite older writers on leadership is James McGregor Burns, who sort of popularized the distinction between transactional and transformational leadership. And one of the things that he said constantly is that transformational leadership is essentially consciousness raising on a wide plane, meaning, sort of at scale, raising people's consciousness about what is possible, what is good, what is right, what's true, what we can accomplish together. And part of what you said reminded me of that, because what you're really getting at is that it's our job as leaders in a ministry context to tell a better story, to use Donnell's language, about what love really is, right? And so as we do that, as we are telling better stories about what love really is, and as we are doing that in a loving way with people that we might consider to be foes, that, there will be tension and conflict and suffering in the midst of that, of course, and risk, maybe the risk of losing a job, or losing a donor, right? Losing families who are key to our congregations. Like, there's risk there. But as we're doing that, we're sort of raising people's consciousness, their understanding about what love really looks like. And that's long-term, difficult work, I think. What about Danny or Brian? How are you guys approaching forming new leaders in your congregations that reflect sort of the character of Christ's leadership?
For me, it's mostly trying to, to use that same language. I mean, it definitely is about telling a different story. I mean, since we've been here, it's been about offering a kingdom narrative, a different narrative than the one that everybody is used to, and then modeling that, trying to show people that you don't push people, you don't yell at people, you don't demand things of people, and showing what, basically living out the better story and demonstrating that in front of people, and gathering people who can do that, and refusing to accept or to pick up those tools that will work, will get the people to do what you need to have done, and refuse to pick those things up, and to do things in the ways of Jesus. And people, honestly, over a period of 3 years, like, I saw people become transformed simply by being offered a different way to lead. They didn't, it wasn't that they were leading before in a way they really liked, or that they were comfortable with. It's just they didn't know a different way. This is just the model that was handed to them. This is how everybody led them, and so this is how they led others. And when they saw that there was a different way, they were happy to find it.
That's good, and also I think speaks to what Yanni shared earlier about the bigger picture, realizing that the good news is good for everybody, right? So that's good. Danny, what about you?
Yeah, well, I do want to preface what I'm about to say in the same way that kind of Donnell did with his words, in the sense of none of this negates the necessity of being prophetic in our world today. Nevertheless, in addition to that, right now, raising Christ-like leaders in our congregation looks like teaching people what it means to be civil again. Just civility, such a basic principle. But why does that matter? Because what our country needs more than ever is people who are able to talk about their issues in a way that can actually lead to forward movement, which involves at least some sense of openness and being willing to listen and not simply reject and toss aside others who see the world in a vastly different way than we do. Nevertheless, right now, we can't talk about issues that matter because we don't know how to talk. We can't even talk about, at this table that we've set here, we can talk about some of these issues. I can't even get to this level of conversation with 50% of my folks because we don't even know how to talk. So we try and teach this notion of holding our beliefs with an open hand instead of a closed fist. I have gone through way too many shifts intellectually, theologically, politically, philosophically over the last 6 years to be proud about what I know to be true. For me personally, when I started Heartway Church, we were a Southern Baptist church. Most of the money that we raise that has still been supporting us is money that I raised from a Reformed Presbyterian church, which is majority white, and the Southern Baptist Convention. I have come a long way from where I was 6 years ago, right? But my point is, I've shifted. I've had so many shifts theologically, intellectually. How could I ever possibly stand before somebody now and say, I'm the enlightened one and I've got the truth? I can't do it. So gotta leave room for people. You know what I'm saying? And I have to recognize too that I can't even cling to truth. I can only cling to God, to Christ in me, because everything else fluctuates and really can change as time goes on and evolves. So I don't even want to hold on to truth, because if I'm holding on to my idea of truth, then I'm going to start hitting people over the head with it. And so what this looks like for us right now is, in our context specifically, I'm not saying this is for everybody, but right now, it looks like, let's learn how to just be able to talk again so that in so doing, bringing a sense of humility into our conversations, and also a willingness to possibly learn from people that we right now think there's no way that they have anything to teach me. For me, that's a red flag danger zone. Red flag danger zone. If I think I'm in a conversation with somebody and I can't learn anything, even if it's how I'm not supposed to be, red flag danger zone for me. So I think as we help people connect more and more to their heart, as we help people really, we talk about it as dissolving their ego in the love of God. Mm-hmm. These kind of conversations can become possible. We humanize one another again. We have to humanize each other again. Mm-hmm. And when we can humanize one another again, then some sort of progress, I believe, can be made. But hey, this may not work, and I may have to change this all up tomorrow. So let's see.
Yeah, you said so much there that I really appreciate. You talked about being on a journey. I'm reminded that one of the better stories that we can tell is to acknowledge the journeys that we have all been on, and to admit that we have changed and gone through our own transformations, and that, you know, should give us grace for others. So I really appreciate you sharing that. So the other thing that you talked about that actually has come up a couple times today, once or twice, is although nobody has put it this way, but what I've heard come up several times is the importance for us as leaders to be self-differentiated from the outcome of what we're doing. That's come up a couple times, and I think it's a really important point. You know, Edwin Friedman was sort of famous for talking about how important it is that leaders be self-differentiated, that they let go of attachment to the outcomes of what they're leading. I found in my own ministry here at Oceanside Sanctuary, especially in the first couple of years when we were experiencing a kind of transformation process, and that was very painful for a lot of people, that it was really important that I not be sort of caught up or triangulated in those ego-based entanglements, to use your sort of characterization of that, Danny. And Friedman, of course, is famous for talking about how the most important thing a leader can do is take care of themselves, which, you know, is a little counterintuitive when he wrote that, because, you know, it sounds like a leader isn't leading if they're just focused on making sure that they're healthy, right? But I found that is extraordinarily true, that the healthier I am, that the better my relationships outside my church are, that, you know, the better I am at taking care of my own body, even the better I am at taking care of my own mind, my own emotional health, that the more useful I am to the people that I'm supposed to be serving here. And so I'd kind of like to maybe end on that note, if we could, and just go around the room and ask, what are you guys doing to take care of yourselves? Like, what works for you to take care of yourself? This is not meant to be like a guilt trip if you're not taking good care of yourself, but just like, I want to learn from what you're doing that's helpful in terms of self-care. And that strikes me as especially important today, the day after such a contentious election. Like, what works for you guys for self-care?
For me, COVID has really wrecked my rhythm of life. Mm-hmm. And so it's really been a struggle for me to try to reestablish healthy rhythms. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I'm finally getting to that place. One of those things is just reestablishing a monthly meeting with a spiritual director. Mm-hmm. And I'm still trying to get in to see a therapist, but everybody I've called is all booked up. Can't imagine why. And then I just practice some of the spiritual disciplines. Basically, the daily examine has been I would say life-saving, but definitely life-giving for me as well. And I listen to my wife, and I do what she tells me.
Thank you for being the first to mention therapy. I think it's extraordinarily important that, especially in the Christian world, that we destigmatize people who are engaged in therapy. So thank you for bringing that up.
So I'll pick that up. I have a therapist, and for a year during my leadership transition, I met with him every week to process it. And I learned some things about myself, like I'm an eternal optimist. Who knew? I wouldn't have described myself that way. Like after our first session, he's like, "You're an eternal optimist." I was like, "Tell me more." He's like, "You think every problem has a solution." And I was like, "Of course every problem has a solution. We just don't know what it is." And he's like, "Aha." so that was good. I've done counseling, therapy. I talk about it from the pulpit. I quote my therapist in revelation, in revelations about myself with my congregation to normalize it. And as a Black man who's come out of a community where, talk therapy isn't our go-to place, right? It's like, hey, why would you go and tell someone your business on that? You keep those things inside in the family, as it were. Spiritual direction's been a hit or a miss for me. There's not a lot of Black spiritual directors. And so it's hard to engage spiritual direction because then I have to overcome so much in that. But I've done it. I have a group of men that I meet with every week. We talk about everything, our lives, our relationships, our moral failures. It's a men's group, and I hate men's groups until I found myself in one for 8 years. And then I was like, oh, I guess they're okay. But, I'm still holding out for that. I walk a lot, just slowing down my pace. I spend a lot of time in front of a screen. And so being outside in nature or biking, I put in 3,000 miles on my bike in the last year, has been really rejuvenating for me. Like I've been able to see God. I've been able to hear God. I've been able to be with God in those ways. And then I consume an inordinate amount of popular culture. So I watch a lot of TV and I read a lot of books where I don't have to think. And I'm usually reading 3 novels a week, which is a place for me to just like solve problems.
What?
And just like you just have a mystery and you get to solve it.
How
you just get
in the world?
Dopamine hit, and then you're
how
good.
do you have time to read 3 novels a week? I'm so
I'll
confused.
tell you later, but I do. I mean, I just got a new book. I just started it on the way to this call. I'm excited. It's about nothing. It's drivel and it's life-giving.
That's so good. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I guess I'll piggyback off of the fact that in the Black community, therapy just was not a thing, is not a thing. But I had to realize the value of therapy. I'm a kidney transplant survivor. And so didn't know that my insurance would have covered therapy the whole time I was going through, right? Sitting on dialysis 12 hours a day and all manners of things happening to my body. I didn't find out till after my surgery that my insurance would have covered therapy the entire time. So therapy has been very valuable in my life. I currently have a South African, an Indian South African therapist. And so the shift in perspective has blown my mind. Similarly, spiritual direction has helped me in the past as I was going through all of these trials and institutionalized racism and homophobic, all manners of things in seminary. A white spiritual director did help me make it through, seeing as how there were no other resources there for me, to tap into after many requests. I've been getting back to my yoga practice. And that's been very helpful and beneficial. I have been tapping into contemplative practices. So Lectio Divina, sitting and listening to the word and kind of just letting it be with me. I recently got into chanting. There's something about that vibration and like feeling it in your body and the embodiment that assists in causing energetic shifts. Also, chiropractor, making sure I stay at the chiropractor, dealing with chronic pain and chronic stuff coming up. acupuncture, also massages. Those are kind of like my trinity of things to keep my body well. And I got accepted into a poetry writing program through USC. So I'm working on my manuscript there. And so that gives me time to just be creative in the midst of, sermon writing or, anything else. So and the motto there is read every day, write every day, and then also committing to 2 studio sessions a week so that I can get my album, My Supernatural Life, out after very many years of not being able to put music out into the world. So.
Yanni, I'm gonna need you to possibly write me my own self-care plan, because yours is like so comprehensive and thorough.
Yo, let's do. I'm a spiritual life coach and a business coach as well. So blending those 2 worlds, I'm like, look, y'all, we got to find balance. So I got you, Danny. I got you.
Look at that. I love it. For me, it's a little bit of yoga, the gym, which is a big part of my life, and it's a great outlet for energy. And lately, you know what it's been for me? It's been my puppy. Oh. I spent some time just with my puppy. Sometimes my wife was coming downstairs the other day, and I was on the floor next to my cockapoo. Her name is Callie. And sometimes, I'm honest, I'm just sitting there looking at her and just not thinking about, just being like a dog, really, because it's just a way to there's this wonderful line in the Tao Te Ching where Lao Tzu says, I'm like an idiot. My mind is so empty. And I feel like I feel like sometimes, like when I'm with my dog, just like hanging out with my dog and there's no words involved, I can be like an idiot and my mind is so empty and I don't have to be thinking about anything. And it's rejuvenating for me. So get a puppy, everybody. It will help.
Okay, well, I rebuke that in the name of Jesus. I'm definitely more of a cat person than a dog person. So we do have a cat, and even though my cat is the meanest soul on the planet, that's actually what I prefer. It's the reason I like cats and not dogs, because I always tell people, you can't trust any creature that gives you its loyalty with no strings attached. Like that, how do you respect an animal that loves you no matter what? Like I need animals that there you go. I need animals that force me to earn their affection. So I have a cat, but we do have 2 dogs. My wife's a dog lover, and that's just the tension in our house. She's a dog person, I'm a cat person. I'll say my spiritual self-care is way less intentional than all y'all's. So I'm super impressed with what you guys are all doing. Like Donnell, I do consume a large amount of popular culture. I find a great deal of solace in watching television shows and reading fiction. I have very, very odd tastes in fiction, though. So unfortunately, I have a hard time finding fiction that I can stick with, but I do enjoy it. And I tend to prefer short stories because I like to be able to read through a story all at once pretty quickly. So those are important to me. And then the other things are maybe the most important self-care practice I've had is maintaining really strong relationships, friendships with people who are not a part of my congregation, who oftentimes are not religious at all. And just spending time with those people weekly, oftentimes going on vacation with them, really doing life together in ways that are really mundane. That has been extraordinarily important to me. I built most of those relationships during a 5-year period when I stepped away from ministry and never thought I was going to be back in ministry again. And God just very graciously brought these people into my life that became some of my best friends, my wife's best friends. And I feel like those relationships in our neighborhood have kept us sane. Whereas when your whole life is the church, that bubble can get really crazy making. And so it was really important for us to have those relationships. And then the last thing I'll say that I've done is super helpful when I can work with my hands and do something that's kind of creative. And so as much as I don't necessarily like home improvement stuff, Like, this summer we rebuilt our deck, which is really big. We have like an 800 square foot deck because our house is on a hill. And so like, because I'm an Enneagram 5, I'm very analytical. So it's very therapeutic for me to have to like solve problems, like how to rebuild this deck that's falling apart, and then, I buy tools and, I hurt myself and cut myself and, chop fingers off and stuff like that. And that whole like process of being like fixing things and building things, I've found actually is really good for my mental and emotional health, which is the excuse I used for just 2 weeks ago buying an old motorcycle so that I can rebuild an old motorcycle. So I don't know if that's self-care or if it's a midlife crisis, but I'm going to call it self-care. So, all right. Well, I've kept you guys way longer than I promised I would. So I want to end plants. There you go. Taking care of plants. That's good. So I really appreciate everybody's time here. This has been, I think, a helpful conversation, if for no reason other than just to give all of us an opportunity to vent a little bit and maybe process a little bit with what's going on in our country right now. So just want to say thank you again to everybody. Donnell Weich, lead pastor at Ann Arbor Vineyard, thank you for joining us again.
It was so good to be here and to be enriched by this conversation.
Yanni Davis, Reverend Yanni Davis with My Supernatural Life. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really great to hear your perspectives on all this.
Thank you. Be peace, no peace, live peace, everybody.
Thank you. And Danny Prada, lead pastor at Heartway Church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. All the best to you as you navigate the tensions in your community that you talked about. I mean, it's true for all of us, but I know that Florida is a really polarized state. So blessings to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Appreciate all of you.
And Brian Metzger, again, lead senior pastor at Raleigh Vineyard in Raleigh, North Carolina. Thanks to you again for your insights. Always really helpful, really good.
Thanks for including me. And it's great to meet everybody. And it's great to get to take part in this. It's always rich for me and I appreciate it.
Awesome. Us too. Thanks, you guys.